Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping back to 1967, a year where three huge events basically collided. You've got a brutal battle on a heavily fortified border, a really mysterious attack on an American spy ship, and a single UN resolution. And what's wild is how the, let's say, creative wording of that resolution, born out of all that conflict, is still shaping the Middle East today.
You know, when you hear about the Six-Day War, you might think, okay, 6 days, war is over, but the official ceasefire, that wasn't really the end. In a lot of ways, it was just the beginning of a much longer struggle. And to really get why, we've got to go to this one specific spot, a heavily fortified border that was basically a powder keg ready to blow.
So, our story really kicks off on the Golan Heights. This is this incredible piece of strategic high ground that separates Israel and Syria. And for months, things had been getting more and more tense. Syria was just relentlessly shelling Israeli communities down below. I mean, the stage was absolutely set for something dramatic and blah. Okay, so when you look at the forces on paper, the imbalance is just staggering. Syria had more troops, more tanks, and more artillery. But the real kicker? They had the high ground. And we're not just talking about a little hill. They had spent almost 20 years turning this place into a fortress.
Yeah, the Syrians really believed their positions were completely unbeatable. I mean, truly impregnable. And this confidence, well, it led them to do something pretty bold. On June 8th, just 5 hours after agreeing to a UN ceasefire, they started shelling Israeli towns again. They must have felt totally untouchable. But as you can guess, that move was about to trigger a massive response. So on June 9th, Israel launched its offensive. And it was just a brutal, step-by-step grind. You had tanks crawling up the super steep terrain, taking heavy losses. Infantry fought for 7 hours just to take a single outpost. But here's where it gets weird. The whole Syrian defense didn't collapse just because of the fighting. Nope. It fell apart because of a bizarre piece of fake news, basically. A radio station in Damascus announced way too early that a key city had fallen, and that just caused total panic and a massive retreat. The fighting was just unbelievably intense. I mean, look at these numbers. Syria had over 7,500 casualties. Israel lost 1,115 soldiers, which really just shows you the incredibly high price of that victory. And just like that, the war on the northern front was over.
But while all of this brutal fighting was happening on land, something else was going down just off the coast. A completely different kind of tragedy was unfolding. And this event, well, it's so controversial that people are still arguing about it today.
Okay, let's talk about the USS Liberty. This was an American spy ship, basically a signals intelligence vessel, and on June 8, 1967, it was just doing its job operating in international waters off the Sinai coast, listening in on the conflict. Now, the Liberty was clearly an American ship. It wasn't involved in the war at all, but a whole cascade of communication failures left it just dangerously exposed. First, the captain asked for an armed escort. That was denied. Then, and this is the really critical part, an order came from the Pentagon telling the ship to pull back. But that message got lost in the system. It didn't actually arrive until hours after the attack was over.
The attack was just swift and absolutely devastating. Earlier that morning, Israeli recon planes had flown right over the ship. Then, suddenly, Israeli jets were on them, hitting the ship with cannons, rockets, and even napalm. After the jets, Israeli torpedo boats showed up. Now, a ceasefire order was given to the aircraft, but the boats went ahead and fired 5 torpedoes anyway. One of them hit its mark, and in an instant, 25 servicemen were killed.
And this brings us to the huge, agonizing question that people have been fighting over ever since. Was this all a tragic, terrible mistake? A case of mistaken identity in the fog of war? Or was it a deliberate attack on an American ship?
So Israel's official story has always been the same: mistaken identity. They said their forces thought the Liberty was an old Egyptian supply ship, but the survivors, well, they point to some major problems with that story. For one, the ship was only moving at 5 knots, not nearly fast enough for a warship, and they swear the American flag was flying and clearly visible, especially to those recon planes that flew right over them that morning. Now, to be fair, the official Israeli report does have some evidence backing it up. It points to the sheer chaos of war. Israeli forces were actively hunting for an Egyptian ship that had just shelled one of their towns. And, interestingly, NSA recordings of Israeli radio chatter do show a lot of confusion. You can hear helicopter pilots being asked to identify the nationality of guys in the water after the torpedo had already hit. And Israel's own internal inquiry found no negligence.
But the doubts just won't go away.
I mean, the top lawyer for the official U.S. Navy investigation later came out and claimed that President Johnson himself ordered a cover-up. And since then, all kinds of other theories have popped up, everything from Israel trying to hide what it was doing in a nearby town to some kind of wild false flag operation. It's all these lingering, unanswered questions that have kept this controversy burning for decades. So the attack on the Liberty, it left this deep, painful scar both politically and for the families involved. At the same time, the end of the war itself was creating this brand new diplomatic reality for the whole region. And it was a reality built on, well, ambiguity.
Let's just pause for a second on the human cost here. The price paid by the crew of the USS Liberty was just immense. 34 Americans were killed, over 170 were wounded, and it was only through their sheer heroism that they managed to keep that badly damaged ship from sinking to the bottom of the sea.
The way the aftermath was handled politically was, well, let's just say it was handled very, very quietly. The ship's captain, William McGonigal, was awarded the Medal of Honor, but not at the White House like you'd expect. It happened in a quiet, unpublicized ceremony. And get this, most of the official awards given to the crew didn't even say who attacked them. They just left Israel's name out of it.
All right, so with the shooting stopped, the world turned to the United Nations. The big question was, could they actually build some kind of lasting peace out of the ashes of this conflict? And what came out of that was UN Security Council Resolution 242. Right up front, in the preamble, it laid down this huge foundational principle of international law. You cannot acquire territory by winning a war. Simple as that. This was supposed to be the absolute cornerstone of any peace deal that came after.
And this is where we get the famous land for peace formula. The whole idea was pretty straightforward on the surface. Israel would withdraw from the territories it occupied during the war. In exchange, it would get peace with its neighbors and, crucially, secure and recognized borders. This one single concept would go on to dominate pretty much every peace negotiation in the region for decades to come.
But right at the very heart of this resolution was a critical and almost certainly deliberate ambiguity. See, the English version of the text calls for Israel's withdrawal from territories occupied in the conflict. But the French version, which is just as official, says des territoires, which translates to from the territories. And that tiny, tiny difference, leaving out the word the, well, it changes everything.
And don't just take my word for it. The British Foreign Secretary at the time, George Brown, flat out admitted that leaving the out was intentional. He said, look, there was no way we could have gotten this resolution passed if that word was in there. So from this point of view, the resolution was always meant to allow for some border adjustments for security reasons, not a complete and total withdrawal.
But, and this is a big but, the guy who actually wrote the resolution, the UK Ambassador Lord Caradon, argued the exact opposite. He said the intent was perfectly clear. Withdrawal was required from all the occupied territories. Why? Because that core principle that you can't acquire territory by war overrides everything else. For him, the only question was which territories were occupied, and, as he put it, that was a matter of plain fact.
So this one little linguistic difference, territories versus the territories, has fueled more than half a century of debates, diplomacy, and yes, conflict. It was a compromise, a fudge, designed to get everyone to stop shooting. But in doing so, it baked a fundamental ambiguity right into the foundation of the peace process. And that leaves us with a pretty big, lingering question, doesn't it?